like their politics or not, but without China, without India, this is just fruitless. And we have to do our very best to get together in these alliances. It's a difficult process. I think we have come step by step. You see what happened in COP Abu Dhabi was maybe not the best offer, but it was not so bad at the end of the day. And I think there is a big willingness worldwide to try to
keep the consensus process going. Ambassador Stina, you're from Norway, which has taken a different position on Israel. But I want to ask you really about how you see conflicts changing the way the world builds these coalitions. For example, the Nordic countries have started to take a separate path, not just on climate change, on global supply chains, on energy routes, than even the rest of Europe. Do you think that that's sub-regionalism is now the way forward, or are people, I think the author Bruno Massais, who's been on JLF quite a lot, spoke about it as tribalism, that as the world goes into more crises, I remember External Affairs Minister Jaishankar, just as the Russian invasion of Ukraine had begun, they were in Australia, and he was asked about how, what India would say at the Quad about the invasion, and he said, last I looked, Russia is not in the Indo-Pacific. So the idea that each of us is looking much more about our region is in trouble, we have to deal with this, other people have to deal with others. Do you think sub-regionalism is going to be the way forward?
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Definitely not. I don't think sub-regionalism is going to be the way forward. I think the world is interlinked, and we see that as a result of these crises. Ukraine was one of the largest grain producers. It's a grain crisis that is affecting Africa, Asia, all of us. Palestine is affecting, or the crisis there is affecting first and foremost the Palestinian people, but regional implication in the Red Sea, and that is also affecting all of us. I was myself in Svalbard, up in the Arctic last year with Indian Minister of Earth Sciences, talking to Indian researchers up there, finding the linkages between ice melting in the Arctic and monsoons and overheating here in India. This is how it's interlinked, and that is why we have to work together. We are part of several regional blocks. You mentioned the Nordic bloc. We are a few small countries having also our own organization, but it is as old as the UN, and we've been working together with the United Nations, and that has been the backbone of what we have been doing in the Nordic region anyway. The Arctic Council, consisting of the eight countries who are bordering the Arctic, that has been a good regional organization where we can talk even with Russia in these days. Although we stopped the cooperation for a while, we took, as Norway, over the chairmanship from Russia, and we are carrying forward in a different way, but still the cooperation, because it's needed. And this is just a part of the bigger global cooperations that we need to have, because all the crises are interlinked.
All right, but even so, I do have to put that same question to you. You know, Norway has often shown itself as the leader of the world when it comes to moving transition to renewable energy and to bring down emissions and all the rest. And yet, in the wake of the Ukraine crisis, Norway is pumping out more oil. In another respect, Norway has, and the parliament has agreed to mining critical minerals. In a way that could also affect the environment, could affect the marine environment. Do you think there is that double standard?
I can understand why you're asking the question. And, you know, we also need to try and keep a couple of thoughts in our heads at the same time. The reinforcement after Russia invaded Ukraine of our delivery of energy to the rest of Europe was a part of that crisis, and it was a result of that. And it will also, in the longer term, help the whole of Europe for the energy transition, and we want to be part of that. Also looking at the seabed, and we have decided now to look at the seabed mineral in part of Norway, but with caution. And we are aware that we don't have enough knowledge yet of that. And it's only when we get that knowledge and when we know if it has an effect that we will actually start mining there. It's not, we have not decided to mine.
All right. I do have one small question for you on the issue of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The way Europe reacted was to walk back on a lot of the globalization outcomes that we had seen. The way the Western world cut off trade with Russia, cut off credit agencies with Russia, cut off travel with Russia, cut off flights, overflights, cut off cultural ties. You know, here in India, we often used to get a lot of lectures on behaving better with our neighbors, of, keeping a lot of these ties going. And yet we suddenly saw the world almost cleave down the top. Do you think part of the crisis is we've become very much about our side or the other side? And there hasn't been a way of bringing them together.
No, I don't think so. Just also to reiterate what my German colleague said, this is our neighborhood. Norway is neighboring Russia. We are a small country. It's a big country invading another neighbor. And it's, of course, existential for us. Like, your conflicts in this neighborhood are existential for India. That does not mean that we are not also looking at the bigger picture and want to be a player also on the whole world stage.
Okay, Ambassador Ajay Bisari, I want to come to you about India's double standards and the idea that we talk about peace in the world. We talk about being Vishwa Gurus. We talk about global stabilizers and bringing these, age-old civilizational values to the world. Yet we live in a neighborhood where our two biggest enemies and our two biggest rivals are nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed countries, China and Pakistan. We don't seem to be able to make a go with either of them, and yet we want to show the world how to go for peace.
So I think our ambitions are really defined by the world we live in. So when we step back and look at it, and Ambassador Saran spoke about it, we see a world in geostrategic terms where there are major contestations going on. It's a world between orders, it's a world in flux, it's a chaotic world. And what we are seeing in terms of contestation today is China defying the United States and the larger West, Russia defying the larger West, and in a sense, Iran defying the larger West in West Asia. So these are three conflicts and contestations, and we need to figure...
You're correcting me. There's actually 4 nuclear-armed neighbors in the region.
Absolutely. And of course, I should add the 4th contestation which impacts us, which is the one between the Democrats and Republicans in the United States. So, but now sticking to the 3, where do we locate ourselves in? Clearly, I think on the China contestation, we are an interested party. We take sides, because here we have a belligerent, revisionist neighbor, a belligerent rise of a country which is challenging the #1 country in the world, and therefore we take sides in multiple ways, whether it expresses itself in Quad or making a larger alliance of democratic parties, democratic countries, and so on. But again, on the other 2, I feel that India has the equities on both sides, not just to be neutral, but to be able to play the peacemaker in both these other conflicts in a calibrated way when the occasion arises. Now, coming back to our neighborhood in your question, I think we stay in a tough neighborhood. And so we have to the north, a tough revisionist, expansionist neighbor. To the west, we have a tough revisionist, irritating neighbor which is not worried about deploying terrorism. And therefore, our dealing with this tough neighborhood is defined by dealing with this army-run state and this party-run state, which are sui generis, which are sort of different states. And we need to have crafted policies focused on these countries. So we continue to be neighborhood first, but we need to have a special set of policies for these two tough neighbors. And I think our ambitions of being Vishwaguru are now down to being Vishwamitra. We are the friend of the world, and we ought to be using those equities, I think, in doing a peacemaking role. But if we have tough neighbors, we need to be tough with them.
All right, tough neighbors require tough responses. But can I ask also about the question of how these populist governments around the world now look at domestic policy as their foreign policy? In other words, their foreign policy becomes a part of political campaigns within the country. And their domestic policy tends to overshadow our relations with other countries. You've been in Canada, apart from, of course, Pakistan, which you wrote the book Anger Management about. And you have seen the impact of India's domestic politics, protests in India, playing out in our relationship with Canada. Do you think at some level, India can say whatever it likes, but people will watch how India walks the talk rather than the talk it actually gives out to the world?
I think it's always been the case that foreign policy is an expression of national interest. And in democracies, you take into account popular opinion, public opinion. Now, I think statesmanship is about crafting national interests, balancing that public opinion rather than being completely guided by that opinion. And I think that balance, you might argue that we've shifted one way or the other, but that is what each country needs to do. And you mentioned the Canada case. I think the United States handled it completely differently from the way Canada handled it. It was dealt with as a security problem. In Canada, it became a sort of political issue. So I think
two countries' domestic politics playing out as foreign policy.
Absolutely.
All right, that's certainly an interesting take on that. And Shambi Sharp, I've saved you for the last. You've been here long enough, so you are aware of our great mythological works in India, and Mahabharata is one of them. And the United Nations has begun to resemble Dhritarashtra, the blind father of the Kauravas who watches as the world is going to cede, as the sons and the nephews are fighting with each other, where there is absolutely no give or take even over a small inch of land. And yet the United Nations just lurches from crisis to crisis. There's the COVID pandemic, people around the world die. China's never held to account for not telling the world earlier about the pandemic and how to deal with it. Western countries are not held to account for holding on to all their resources. Nobody is held to account for the way they dealt with the pandemic in their own countries. The United Nations wasn't even really able to bring together the world to agree on something simple. Of course, that was at the WTO, on doing away with all the special patents and restrictions when it came to COVID medicine and ensuring that everyone could produce that COVID medicine. So I'm just using one example. I've already spoken about all these other crises where the UN seems to pass statements. The UN Secretary General says Gaza is a graveyard for children. And yet, nobody is able to stop the bombardment of children over there. And I'm talking about the most recent case of a crisis where the UN just seems to be very powerless. Finally, it seems to be completely powerless in reforming itself. You know, physician, heal thyself, but it doesn't seem as if the UN is ready for that kind of reform. How do you react to this great responsibility that the UN was given 100 years ago, or nearly 100 years ago? We said never again. We said so many other things about a global world order. And honestly, in 2024, we're wondering what's going to follow the UN by 2045.
Well, thank you. So, right, the last but not least, that's quite a mouthful question there. But first of all, mujhe JLF mein aakar bahut khushi hui. Always need to say that. I think that what we've been hearing is argument for more UN, not less UN. And to invoke the famous quote from Madeleine Albright, right? The UN needs to reform. The UN is reforming. And if we didn't have it, we would just need to invent it. So, you know, we're looking at, we just had the hottest year on record in maybe 100,000 years. We have wars in all over the place. We have pandemics, these sorts of things. And yet, I would also, we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, you know, they're terribly off track. Only 15% sort of on track, this kind of a thing. And everyone is talking about alliances and working together and common challenges and common responses. Now here I would say, actually I would push back a little bit. The UN is doing a huge amount of good in the world. I mean, the UN is protecting 117 million people forced out of their homes from conflict, from climate, providing you know, vaccinations for 45% of the world's children, you know, these sorts of things. So a little bit sort of, as Eric mentioned, don't look at just the top, the president of a country or something. You know, we can't just look at the Security Council. That's not the whole UN. And in fact, there's so much else there. But the Secretary General does say, look, we need reform. No one wants reform of especially the Peace and Security Council more than the staff of the UN, the SG on down. He says, how can we have an organization delivering a future for our grandchildren that was designed for our grandparents? So there's no doubt about that, right? But as Shakespeare said, you know, the world is a stage. And I think Shashi Tharoor is the one that I first heard say, the UN is both an actor and a stage. It's a stage for the member states to come together and to deliver things like the COP process, like the High Seas Treaty, like you know, plastic ban that's coming. So many important developments are happening. But those member states have to agree on peace and security, and when they do, then the UN becomes an actor. Then the UN steps in. We see, you know, peacekeeping missions across the world. There's so many also very important examples of that. So that's really a complexity that we really have to keep in mind.
Do you see UN reform having moved even an inch in terms of the expansion of the Security Council? It's a question you'll hear much about in India. Do you see the needle having moved at all?
It's a very interesting question. Yes and no. But there's a process been underway. Working groups have been set up for about 15 years. It hasn't yet gotten to that formalized stage. But what I would say to, you know, there is a risk that we lose, especially we look at the P5. Again, it's member states' decisions, that we lose some space in this world to the what's are sometimes called minilaterals. Right? So you've seen actually in the last year, and India has been very much at the forefront of some of these processes. You see the G20 expanding. African Union was brought in by India's leadership. You see BRICS expanding. You see, you know, so some of this perceived vacuum, this space is being filled. So I think what we as an institution are hoping is that we can get agreement, especially in the Security Council, that there is more to gain by expanding and reforming than there is to lose. And India's leadership in this space as well, I would just note in terms of climate action, right? Something happened, the world changed between COP26 and COP27. Ukraine war has been mentioned. And for the wrong reasons, unfortunately, we saw a more honest debate that high-income countries started to fire up some coal power, right? Because it's a crisis. Well, the developing world, and India's leading voice, said, look, your crisis is our regular reality. You look at India. Two-thirds of India's cities have not yet been built. It's, you know, Minister Hardipuri talks about India will need to add a Chicago every sort of 2 years or something like that. How do you do that on the basis of the right to development, climate action, climate justice?
All right. Certainly an interesting panel over here. I've asked the organizers, since we started late due to the rain, if we could take just a few questions. I see a lot of hands up. And I'm going to go to the lady in the fourth row, I think. Just ask your question. Just ask a very quick question.
Yes, so my question is tilted towards climate crisis. Are people losing trust with COP? I mean, people lost already their hopes from Paris Agreement, now yearly COPs. Campaigners are upset. So, I mean, people and government both needs to be motivated in order to meet targets. It's like every country is on their own. So, that's my question.
All right. And I'm going to take just 2 more, so go ahead. Just give it to the gentleman here to the left.
Hello. So, as a country, as a world, we are facing multiple crises right now. There's the climate, there are the wars. So, and the most popular solution that has been given by this panel is that we should come together. So my question is there any other solution that can be proposed to the world that can be a more, I don't want to say efficient, but as another solution?
Basically, elect one country the leader of the world and let them do whatever they want. And there's one lady right at the edge, and we'll end it there. Right there.
Hello everyone. So my question for the panel is, like, with all the polycrises happening around in the world and the superpowers such as China and America being in war among themselves, how is the undermining authoritative nature of UN in solving the crisis be solved? Because even though there are crises happening around the world and even though a ceasefire was ordered, a humanitarian ceasefire was ordered, but no action was taken under then. So people are kind of losing their faith in the authoritative nature of UN. So what are the superpowers like, such as America, China, India, European Union doing about it? Like how to solve that problem so that we can reinstate our faith in the UN as being a guarding body?
All right, 3 quick questions. I'm going to get them to some of our panel. Ambassador Garcetti, do you want to take on the question of whether the US-China rivalry is really wrecking things for the rest of the world, and can US and China actually get together?
Well, certainly we hope not, and we're engaging with China, which is in everybody's interest, especially around climate, which is one of the areas we've kept alive. But, you know, this is not that the world order is crumbling.